Hi folks, this is the third of the three parts to the session on central place theory. This is where we stack the layers of hexagonal trade areas to see what we can see about the complexity of urban systems. This first slide shows you that this is happening at multiple levels within the hierarchy all at the same time. So what this diagram shows you are two levels of urban places in terms of their size, a village and a town. The village is smaller than the town. And what we see on this diagram is that there are three towns and there are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 villages. Let's see if I have that right. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yep, so there are 13 villages on this diagram. Sorry about the pause. I was just making sure my math was correct. What you see here is that for village level goods and services, the kinds of goods and services that are found in villages, and that in villages there are no other higher order goods and services. Now remember that the town also offers bread. So people can go to the town to buy the lowest order of goods and services. But there are these interstitial areas that are served only by villages. And that's why you get the circular dots at the corners of the larger hexagons. And if you look at the arrangement of hexagons in this diagram, what you see is that there are village level hexagons or trade areas that define how people travel in order to consume those very basic goods and services. The lines that create these hexagons are labeled as the threshold or the inner range for the village level function. Okay, so that's one level. But at the same time, you have these larger places, these towns, that offer these higher order goods and services. And there is a set of competitively defined hexagonal trade areas associated with town level functions. And so that's labeled on the diagram as well. I'll highlight that for you. So here we have the definition for the inner range for the town level function. Now, in this diagram, what you see is that there are zones of excess profit. And these are for, I'm circling them at the bottom of the diagram, and they are shaded in green, and they lie outside of the circle, the white circle. And these are zones for which people are willing to travel into the town to consume those goods and services, but they're not at the highest level for a town. So they are higher level than the kinds of goods and services that you would find in a village, but they're not at the maximum level that you would find in a town. What this means is that this is excess profit. That's a zone of excess profit. The inner range, the threshold for these, what I'm describing here on this diagram as sub-maximum town level functions, is defined by the circle. So I think that as you can look at this diagram, you can see that by layering these levels of the hierarchy of goods and services and looking at the arrangement of the urban places that are associated with each level, you can come up with a fairly sophisticated landscape. So village, town, and city, and that those four levels of places go from smallest to largest. The hamlets have the small red circles. The village have the green squares. The towns have the purple circles, and there's only a single city at the center of the entire diagram. So there are four levels of retail-based hexagonal trade areas, with each layer of hexagonal trade areas defined by this competitive process. And what we see when we look at this diagram in general, thinking back to the basic observations, how many large cities are there? Only one. If we were to find out, if we were to extend this diagram over a broader area, we'd find out that the next city over would be basically up in here somewhere. And then there would be another one that would be down right about here. So the city level urban places are few, and they are far apart. If we look at the smallest levels in the hierarchy, the urban hierarchy, the red circles, we see that there are lots of little hamlets around the landscape, and they are much closer together than are the cities. So just starting with our basic principles of competition, economic competition, and a neoclassical process, we end up with a landscape that looks something like what we started with in terms of our basic observations. Next slide shows you a animated GIF, or GIF, depending on your preference, of how these layers come together. So I'll play that a few times for you, and it's basically going to end up with a diagram that's very similar to the one that I showed you on the previous slide, except that it has apparently 3 layers in the hierarchy. And so I'll show it to you again. This is from Wikipedia, by the way. Oops, sorry. I jumped ahead of myself. All right, so there's your animation one more time. I'm back on the slide with the animated GIF. So there's your largest layer, the next smallest layer, the third smallest layer, and the very smallest layer. So I guess there are 4 layers in this hierarchy. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the question is, now that central place theory can capture these very basic rudimentary observations, what happens when we allow the reality of the real world to come back in? Well, the answer is that it distorts things. It distorts the model, and it makes the model more complicated. And this is always going to be true. When we consider the messiness of reality, these analytical models become much more complicated. So we'll look at a couple of these, and then we'll kind of sum up. One complication that actually did happen is that transportation did not remain walking across the flat plains or getting into your buckboard wagon and driving across the fields. There were roads that came to be established, and once roads were put into the landscape, it changed the distance and the time that were required for travel to an urban center. And what you see in this diagram is a hexagon, the basic hexagon, which is a little distorted in terms of shape, but we won't worry about that for just a moment, in the beginning. And so that the original hexagon was where the dotted lines are in the center. In the middle of the hexagon is a town or a small city. And then eventually they put in a highway or a road, which is the straight line that goes across. What happens is that if you happen to live close to the road, then you can travel a farther distance for the same amount of time and the same amount of cost, right? Because of how much easier the road makes it for you to move around. What that's going to do is it's going to distort the shape of the hexagon. It's going to pull it out, stretch it out, and it's going to increase it. Now, that space on this diagram that is added to the original hexagon, so I'm highlighting it with my nifty pencil here, those spaces that are added come at the expense of the hexagon that sits adjacent to the one that we're looking at. So what happens is that the trade area that belongs to the hexagon of the town that we're considering grows in size with distorted shape, and it is at the expense of perhaps a town that is not on the highway. So that's not really a circle, it's not, but that's what it's supposed to be. I'm drawing in a little town over here. This town's hexagon will shrink. It'll become smaller, and it will lose customers competitively because they will now be willing, the customers that live in this space here that I'm shading in, those customers are going to be willing to travel to the blue city at the middle of this diagram instead of going to this place that maybe as the crow flies closer, but it's actually easier to go to the larger place. And it becomes larger, and this other city or town over here actually will shrink, and sometimes it actually will cease to exist. But you see this all the time. If you look at the historical development of the landscape in this period of time, what started out as a whole array of small towns, small hamlets, some of them survive and grow larger while others die away. And this explains part of that, because those that survive are most likely going to be on or very close to the improved transportation routes, and these transportation routes are typically fixed in place. They don't go moving around the landscape. All right, here's a second way that distortions or realities happen. Income and population density work very similarly. So at the top, you see a pair of hexagons, one larger than the other, and you see a big bold arrow going from the large one to the small one. This is what happens when income or density increase over time. If the purchasing power of every household increases, then you need smaller areas to stay in business, because those folks are going to spend more of their income, relatively speaking, and they're going to both ratchet upwards in terms of the hierarchy of goods and services, and they're going to buy more of the basic commodities at the bottom of the chain. So the size of the hexagonal trade areas required to keep folks in business will shrink. You need fewer people, you need a smaller area. When income goes up, you need a smaller area because there are already more people if you have a densification process. When income declines, or when density decreases, now the density for most of the time that we're going to be talking about over the next several sessions did not decrease, but sometimes income would, when there was a recession, for example, or in the aftermath of some natural event. When income declines, the trade area required to keep a business going expands. So at the bottom of this diagram, you see that a larger trade area now becomes required to keep the business going, because you need to have greater purchasing power, and either you need more people to compensate what you need. Let me put it more simply. What you need are more people to compensate for the fact that every household has less money to spend. All right, so when you put transportation and these density questions together, what you get is a really messy landscape. Now, on one side, what you see here are a series of what started out as pristine hexagonal trade areas that were distorted in terms of shape and size by transportation and by population density. Now, the resultant diagram is, in fact, more realistic in the sense that it actually does capture what you see when you look at real landscapes, but you lose the simplicity of the model. Now, that's okay. What it's illustrating is that the basic processes that the model captures seem to be at work, at play. And the realities that make the model less superficially descriptive sometimes can be accommodated within the context of the model by making the model itself more complicated, but otherwise you might have to move to a different way of thinking about things to capture the details of the messiness that you see. All right, some things to take away from central place theory. It addresses a big question, first of all, which is, how do urban systems develop under capitalism? It's an important question. It does so in a contextually and theoretically limited fashion, however. It works best for flat agrarian landscapes. I'm skipping ahead to the third point. As they existed in the middle of the 19th century in the US, it worked pretty well in Germany in the early part of the 20th century. It only considers the commercial functions of cities. It is not designed to consider cities as places of industry or places of political power or places of cultural production and consumption, for example. The theory, which is the theory of neoclassical economics, must make sometimes almost absurdly stark simplifying assumptions for the model to work. Even with these weaknesses or with these characteristics, however, central place theory does in fact do a decent job of accounting for the basic questions, the basic observations about the size, the number, and the spacing of urban places across the landscape. And it does so even in areas that don't really resemble the simplifying assumptions. And finally, the basic logic of central place theory can in fact be applied to other kinds of questions, not just the size and spacing of cities, but for example, you can start to look at the size and spacing of retail establishments within cities. Think about grocery stores, for example, and other places where you can buy food commodities. Think about all the places where you can buy a jug of milk or a loaf of bread. It's not just in grocery stores, right? But you can also buy milk and bread in very large grocery stores. But think about the number and the spacing of these food-oriented retail establishments across the landscape within cities, and the logic of central place theory can help you make sense of it. And then finally, there's a whole genre of consumer behavior research that starts with some of these ideas that were developed as part of central place theory. So the last slide that I'll show you is a map of Georgia settlements. You can see here it's centered on Monroe, which is in between Athens and Atlanta. And if you go through and you count up the number of large places on this map, they will be smaller in number and farther apart than the number of small places on this map. So again, the theory, even though it has these simplifying assumptions and some restrictions, does in fact describe and help us make sense of what otherwise can be pretty complicated landscapes. Okay, a lot there. There we go. Bye-bye.